Hello everyone, my name is Quentin Parker. This week we are going to be discussing diversity and stability in ecology. The paper I'm using to discuss diversity and stability is a study by Nils M van Rooijen, Wanda de Kiersmaker, Wim A. Ozinga, Paul Koppen, Stephen M. Hennekens, Joop H.J. Chaminade, Ben Sommers, and Olivier Honnet, titled Plant Species Diversity Mediates Ecosystem Stability of Natural Dune Grasslands in Response to Drought. The research was a collaboration between the Biology Department of Katholieke University at Rooijen in Belgium, the Wageningen University and Research Center in the Netherlands, and the Radboud University in Nijmegen Department of Experimental Plant Ecology, which is also located in the Netherlands. The research article was published in June of 2015 in the journal Ecosystems. I chose this paper as it quantified the stability of an environment in relationship to both plant species diversity and plant functional diversity under fluctuating drought conditions. In the paper, researchers used vegetation biomass production to represent stability of a system under drought conditions. The reasoning for comparing biomass production variation is that with more stable biomass production, there was less impact on food availability for herbivores to forage on, and this would make surviving drought conditions more manageable for higher trophic levels. Before we get started, I wanted to review some key points in history discussed by Dr. Jodas in order to bring us to the purpose of this paper. Starting with H.A. Gleason's paper in 1926, Gleason pointed out that vegetational assemblages do not exist as fixed and definite systems, but are constantly changing. These changes result from various perturbations that alter the neat structure of an environment. Furthermore, these disturbances create environments that are unique from other environments of similar vegetation structure. Next, in 1936, Clements showed that plant succession eventually reaches a climax state. At this climax, competition in the system is reduced, and the system is overall considered more stable. You'll recall that Clements' definition of stability differs from how we define it today. And in Hutchinson's 1959 paper, he argued that stability increases with the number of links in a food web. By this, he means that the more species that are involved in a food web, the more stable the system is overall. Since the loss of one species in food web can be mediated by utilizing other species. Counter to previous ideas, May in 1971, which is different than his 1947 paper that we read, countered that ecosystem stability decreases when there are more predator-prey interactions. Using mathematical models, he found that systems are less stable with higher diversity, and he argued that stability at one trophic level is dependent on the stability of the system as a whole. This view lines up with what Dr. Jodas described as the prevailing view of diversity and stability in the 1970s. Currently, the predominant view is that ecosystems with higher diversity are more stable overall, even though the stability of individual species decreases with higher diversity levels. I know that during my own undergraduate ecology courses and with current wildlife management courses I've taken, a key idea has been that maintaining biodiversity in a system is better for the system overall. Makes it more stable, as this diversity acts as a buffer against having the system fail from perturbation or fluctuation in the environment. Next, going back to Dr. Jodas's lecture on stability, I wanted to cover a quick refresher on what it means for a system to be stable in regards to this paper. I believe that the best way to understand stability involves thinking about the properties of stability. So you can think of a system being stable when it ultimately remains unchanged overall. While it can fluctuate temporarily, the fluctuations are limited, and the system returns to a stable state over time. Additionally, there are some similar terms similar to stability that I want to review, as these can be useful to you when writing your own research in the future. These are constancy, which means staying essentially unchanged; resilience, which means returning to the reference state or dynamic after a temporary disturbance; persistence, which means lasting through time in an ecological system; and resistance, which means staying essentially unchanged despite the presence of disturbances. All right, so finally we will dive into the paper itself. So, recent climate change has brought about more extreme conditions throughout the globe. The effects of climate change have led to an increased frequency and volume of disturbances in various systems. These range from droughts, extreme storm events, increased wildfire intensity, etc. The stability of plant species richness is important for ecosystem stability. An explanation for this is the concept of compensatory dynamics, which is when a negative change in the level of functioning of one species is associated with the positive change in the functioning of another species. This drives the stabilization of ecosystem properties such as biomass production. So, how does biodiversity stabilize an ecosystem over time? In 2013, Leroux and Mazencourt proposed 3 mechanisms of how increased biodiversity stabilizes an ecosystem. First, different species respond asynchronously to perturbations, meaning they are affected at different rates. This spreads out the effect of the disturbance over time. Second, species rebound at different rates to perturbations. Again, this spreads out the effects of the disturbance over time. These first 2 mechanisms spread out the effects of the perturbation temporally, which reduces the severity of the perturbation's impacts overall. And lastly, with compensatory dynamics, the importance of interspecific competition is reduced, as one species will thrive with the reduction of its neighboring species. This balance maintains a compensatory balance of biomass production for upper trophic levels. A novel concept that the authors address is the role of plant functional diversity on the stability of an ecosystem. The authors hypothesize that an ecosystem with greater plant functional diversity will be more stable over time. Plant functional traits are defined as plant properties that impact growth, reproduction, and survival. With these concepts in mind, we can dive into the purpose and research objectives of the paper. Overall, the purpose of the study was to quantify how plant species diversity and plant functional diversity correlate with the stability of above-ground biomass production in a naturally assembled dune grassland ecosystem that is affected by fluctuating drought conditions. More specifically, the authors had 2 main objectives. First, they wanted to combine long-term climate data and satellite images in order to quantify the effects of drought in a calcareous dune grassland ecosystem, as well as correlate how precipitation changes affect biomass production. Secondly, they wanted to quantify how plant species richness and diversity, as well as plant functional diversity in a dune grassland ecosystem, mediates biomass production during drought conditions. So, why is this study important for research? What's the big deal? Well, most previous empirical research has focused on much smaller scales. The research conducted by Rooijen et al. Is spread along a long portion of the Netherlands coastline. Additionally, previous research focused on either short or long-term time frames. but not both simultaneously. With this research, the authors studied the plots over a 10-year period to observe broad changes in biomass production rates, while additionally observing short-term changes from drought events. Furthermore, much of the previous research conducted has been experimental, focusing on plots with set numbers of plants within each plot. And for this experiment, researchers compared plots of natural systems containing various levels of species abundance. Finally, the data and the analysis of the data used was all based on continuous data, which will pop up later in the discussion. So instead of comparing biomass production, the authors compared the changes of biomass production from drought in areas of different diversity levels. So this data is a trend line rather than specific data points. I point this out as the authors compare trends rather than defined groups such as plot 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 with different levels of species. And so keep that in mind when we get to the results and discussion portion of the paper. And lastly, I just wanted to point out that this was an observational study as opposed to an experimental study. All right, so the study sites consisted of calcareous dune grassland ecosystems along the western coast of the Netherlands. Study sites ranged from the Belgian border to the south and went as far north as the village of Bergen, as you can see from the map. In order to quantify the presence and quality of vegetation in the dune grassland ecosystem, researchers used moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer normalized difference vegetation index, or MODIS NDVI, data collected from the NASA Land Processes Distributed Active Archive Center. The data has a physical resolution of 250 meters by 250 meters per pixel, and additionally it has a temporal resolution of 8 days, which means that there's an image for every 8 days recorded. So NDVI works by recording the wavelengths reflected to the sensor. Healthy vegetation reflects more near-infrared and green light while absorbing more red light. Using the shown equation, the program compares the difference between the two readings to show the presence of vegetation while measuring the vegetation's health, or growth, I should say. The total data set was reduced to a final selection of 48 pixels for the study. All pixels used were areas with similar abiotic conditions and management policies. All right, so NDVI data variation results from 4 different occurrences: seasonal changes, short-term changes from weather events, such as perturbations, atmospheric noise and sensor noise, which is essentially junk data, and overall long-term trends. Using NDVI data, Van Rooijen et al. Quantified short-term responses of biomass production in response to precipitation variability during summer growing months. So vegetation data for the research was collected from the Dutch National Vegetation Database between 1995 and 2000. Meaning the data was collected prior to the start of the study. Species cover abundance was quantified using 2 meter by 2 meter plots using the Braun blanket scale, which we'll cover in the next slide. The coverage scales were then transformed into percentages for comparison. Available vegetation data was reduced from 640,000 recordings to only 707 recordings alongside the MODIS data to match up with cells representing homogeneity for both diversity classifications and structural classifications. Species richness was assumed not change during the study period, and this assumption was tested and verified by yearly sampling of 5 random dune grassland permanent plots that were monitored for a 24-year study. Species richness and diversity did not change for the sampled plots during the study period. For each of the 48 pixels used, species diversity indices were calculated from the Dutch National Vegetation Database using the JUICE software package. JUICE is a program that has several vegetational applications, such as vegetational classification, calculating interspecific relationships, as well as other applications. For this paper, the authors used JUICE to classify phytosociological data. So phytosociology is a branch of science used primarily in Europe for various classifications of vegetation communities. It is also referred to as the Blond-Banquet approach, which describes how the plots were classified in the previous slide. Species diversity was calculated using the Shannon-Wiener index. So the Shannon-Wiener index is a measure of diversity based on information theory that characterizes the number of species within a sample plot. Next, they calculated functional diversity of an area using Rau's quadratic entropy equation. Rau's quadratic entropy equation is a measure of diversity of ecological communities. It is based on the proportion of the abundance of species present in a community while using measures of dissimilarity of functional traits. So before we continue, I wanted to introduce and further explain some of the indices that were used for testing. Additionally, I wanted to explain the abbreviations and equations before explaining the statistical methods used in results section. So the easiest, N sub R, refers to species numbers in a plot. H prime is the Shannon-Wiener index, which is a measure of diversity in the plot. It is calculated by taking the sum of the proportion of individual species times its natural log. Next, evenness describes the similarity of proportions of species across different units in a study area. It was calculated by dividing the Shannon-Wiener index by the natural log of the total number of species. Rau's quadratic entropy, which describes functional diversity in a plot and is represented by FD sub Q, is calculated by summing the trait differences among species, which has been multiplied by the proportion of that species within the plot. Lastly, trait difference between species, which is used to calculate Rau's quadratic entropy, and is identified as in the equation as D sub ij, which I and j referring to individual species, two individual species, is calculated by taking 1 over t, which is the number of traits being considered, and multiplying it by the sum of the total differences in the traits between species I and species j. Traits used to define functional diversity include specific leaf area, leaf size, dry matter content, leaf mass, root depth, and canopy height. All trait values were standardized to values between 0 and 1. So meteorological data for temperature, precipitation, and potential evaporation were provided by the Royal Meteorological Society of the Netherlands. These variables were used to calculate the standard precipitation and evapotranspiration index, SPEI. This index is used to calculate measures of drought in an area, so it fits perfectly with this study. So, in the study, the researchers compared the change in biomass production in relation to the drought index with the covariables. We will refer to the trend line as the response coefficients, or p-response. P-response was correlated as the general linear regression slope of the effect of the standard precipitation and evapotranspiration index on the NDVI anomaly data. So I pretty much just repeated that twice. So just to make it clear, the response variable is the slope of the effect of the drought index on NDVI anomaly data, which is the short-term changes in biomass production. Okay. Furthermore, the p-response variable was then correlated with diversity indices such as species richness, species diversity, the evenness index, and functional diversity. And these were all tested through general linear regression. Grassland vegetation type was used as a fixed effect in the analyses, and all analyses were performed using the various R statistics program packages listed. So FD, APE, LME4, and Beacon. Now on to the results. So overall, short-term biomass production, or NDVI anomaly, was highly correlated with the precipitation and evapotranspiration index, or SPEI. As you can see from the low p-value in Table 1. So in fact, 29% of the variance was explained based on the SPEI value index. And then looking at Figure 3, with NDVI anomaly as a solid line and SPEI as the dotted line, you can see that the two lines fluctuate mostly in the same pattern as one another, showing high correlation between the two factors. Again, this was confirmed through the ANOVA in Table 1. Of the indices being tested, species richness and diversity had a significant correlation with the response coefficients. Evenness had no correlation with the response coefficients, and you can see in Table 2 that the indices tested along with their p-values. Overall, the researchers found that extreme drought events resulted in reduced overall biomass production across the study plots. So these events occurred in 2003, 2006, 2009, 2010, and 2011. And you can clearly see that the two variables are related to one another through the rises and the drops temporally. So looking at the relationship of the change in biomass production, or p-response, with species number and diversity shows that the two variables helped mediate the effects of drought in plots containing more diversity. The researchers found that the variables helped minimize the effects of drought on biomass production when compared to plots that weren't as diverse. Plots with more species diversity showed an increased resistance of the effects of drought on biomass production, and these results are in agreement with several other experimental studies showing that species diversity helps stabilize an ecosystem. So, looking at Figure 4a, this shows species richness on the x-axis and the response coefficient on the y-axis. So, the response coefficient refers to the change in slope of biomass production from drought conditions. So this is change in biomass. This doesn't mean plus or negative, it just means how much it changes. And so you can see from in plots with lower species richness, you've got a higher change in biomass than in plots with higher species richness. And so this shows that plots with lower species richness, there's more of a change in biomass production than in plots with higher species richness. And the same thing goes for species diversity. In plots with lower amounts of species diversity, you've got more of a change in biomass production than you do in plots with higher species diversity. All right, and looking at figures 4C and 4D in regards to the change in biomass production due to drought versus both evenness and functional diversity there's no correlation with either of these two values. So finally, I'm going to discuss some reasons why species diversity helps mediate ecosystem stability. Looking at this research, overall biomass production was reduced during the drought across the plots. However, plots with higher species diversity were less impacted by drought than plots with fewer diversity. One reason for this is that more diverse systems have a higher degree of asynchronous responses to the drought. Since species response and recovery rates are spread out temporally, the amount of biomass production is less impacted than in less diverse systems. Furthermore, there's a higher chance of compensatory dynamics in more diverse systems, as more drought-tolerant plants take advantage of the decline in other species. And this leads to a more stable biomass production overall. Next, I want to cover reasons why species functional diversity did not affect biomass production and therefore ecosystem stability, at least in this dune grassland system. So first, it is important to point out that species functional diversity has likely been reduced from environmental pressures of the dune system. These environmental pressures would likely select for certain functional traits, and limit the addition of other functional diversity to inhabit the ecosystem. Next, the authors pointed out that temporal response traits in species were much more important than functional differences. By species holding similar niches, but responding over different timescales, the plants complement each other in the system. This is known as functional compensation. As their function is maintained temporally in the system, overall the system is more stable. Before wrapping up with my conclusions, I wanted to include some results and figures from another paper on a similar research. So the second paper on diversity and ecosystem stability is by Tillman et al. And is titled Biodiversity and Ecosystem Stability in a decade-long grassland experiment. Much like the first paper, Tillman et al. Focused on recording biomass production in a grassland over a 10-year study. Unlike the first paper, there were no ongoing perturbations that interfered with growth. So the study was mainly testing variation of biomass production in plots containing different numbers of species. Whereas the first paper was strictly observational, this paper was based off of an experiment that manipulated the number of species per plot. I wanted to include the figures of this paper as the results are much more straightforward than the previous paper, or at least the figures are much more straightforward. So if you look at the top graph, the y-axis in figure 1a, ecosystem stability is the ratio of the mean plot total biomass divided by its temporal standard deviation, meaning the average change in biomass production per year. So, with an increasing temporal standard deviation, the lower the number of the plot point on the graph. On the x-axis is the species number treatment, meaning the number of plants per treatment. As you can see, biomass production varies less as the number of species increases in a plot. Looking at figure 1b, on the y-axis, species stability refers to the variation of mean species biomass production for a time period divided by its temporal standard deviation over the same interval. As mentioned above, higher temporal standard deviation leads to a lower overall value on the plot point. So as you can see, and again on the x-axis is the species number treatment, meaning the number of species per plot. As you can see in figure 1b, species stability decreases as the species number increases, as the species number treatment increases. So I'll finish with some overall conclusions from the paper. Species diversity stabilizes ecosystems both temporally and during perturbations. Species functional diversity does not affect ecosystem stability, so far that we know, at least from this study. With climate change increasing the intensity and frequency of environmental perturbations, maintaining species diversity and management is important for the resilience and stability of ecosystems. This concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, just send me an email. Hopefully I can respond to them pretty quickly. And have a great week and good luck on the quiz. Thank you. Bye.